Let's start by going over a simple way of classifying different interactions that could occur between two species sharing a community. Say rabbits and coyotes. Each will have its own population dynamic, DNRDT for rabbits and DNCDT for coyotes. Will the number of rabbits, NR, have an effect on the dynamic for coyotes? Will the number of coyotes, NC, have an effect on the dynamic for rabbits? Yes and yes. What we want to pay attention to here is the sign, positive or negative, of the effect. We agree that NR is going to have an effect on DNCDT. Is the sign on that arrow going to be positive or negative? If the number of rabbits increases, does the growth rate of coyotes increase along with it, or is it going to decrease? Why, yes, I agree. More rabbits means more food for coyotes, and this will result in a higher growth rate. The effect is a positive one. What about the reverse? The effect of NC on DNRDT is going to be, yeah, negative. Increasing number of coyotes will increase the mortality rate of the rabbit population, causing it to grow more slowly than it would with fewer coyotes. Positive in one direction, negative in the other. We classify this and all predator-prey interactions as plus minus. The same classification applies to parasite-host and herbivore-host plant interactions. One species benefits the other, while the other hurts the first species. If you think about mutualistic interactions, say a pollinator like a bee and the flower that it pollinates, NB is going to have a positive relationship with DNF DT because the bees are benefiting the flowers. And NF has a positive relationship with DNBDT because more flowers around means more food and more growth for the bees. Mutualistic interactions are plus plus. Interspecies competition, like the sheep and goats from the previous lecture, classify as minus minus. These are the interactions you might expect fewest opportunities for the interacting species to co-evolve. You could also have commensal interactions, plus zero, in which one species gains from the presence of the other, which is indifferent to the existence of the species taking the strong benefit. Good examples of this include the many species taking advantage of human development, things that would exist if we weren't around but in far fewer numbers. Think about how many fewer Drosophila melanogaster fruit flies there would be without supermarket dumpsters. Rats and mice have benefited enormously from having 7 billion plus people on the planet, though it's arguable about whether humans are actually indifferent to the presence of the rats and the mice. And there are tons of birds that thrive only because they're adapted to urban life. House sparrows and pigeons come to mind. An ecological community is comprised of many populations of different species that are harmed by, helped by, or indifferent to the other species in their orbit. If we wanted a more complete, real-world picture in our sheep-goat discussion from the last lecture, we'd have to account for goats being impacted by more species than just the sheep. There are populations of food plants, predators, parasites, mutualists, all of which could be incorporated into the population dynamic for goats, though we only accounted for sheep in our analysis. The problem with expanding the model to account for more potentially interesting variables is one of tractability. And just because you can put things into a mathematical model doesn't mean that you'll be able to gain any valuable insights. Complex, highly interconnected systems tend to have complex, if not chaotic, behavior. At some point, you may reach a point where there's such a huge array of possible outcomes that the model becomes essentially useless. It would be telling you basically that anything is possible. And yet, the ramifications of everything being interconnected can be profound and surprising. We've mostly all seen this video about how the return of wolves to Yellowstone affected nearly everything about the ecosystem. You might have expected that the herbivores wolves prey on would be affected, but the degree to which things changed for the vegetation in the rivers and even the fish, that's what made this video go viral. The take-home message of the Yellowstone wolf example is that biological populations can have dramatically important roles in shaping whole ecosystems, and these effects are mediated through the very community interactions that we're thinking about in today's lesson. Our first example is a kind of scaled-down version of the Yellowstone wolves. In marine, hard-bottom communities, you often have encrusting organisms competing for space on the bottom. If you go to your favorite tide pools area, you'll find mussels, barnacles, sea anemones, limpets, algae, probably other species as well. All are there in your habitat, but that doesn't make sense to you because, well, competitive exclusion. One species should win and drive the others to local extinction, right? Well, it turns out that there's a species in your tide pool community responsible for this coexistence of many species in the encrusting community. It's the sea star, who's a voracious predator that mows down encrusting invertebrates in proportion to their abundance. This would be an example of density-dependent predation. The starfish are hardest on whatever species of prey is most abundant, and consequently, you get coexistence of many encrusting species, which is something you don't expect without the predator. Now, you decide that you can demonstrate this experimentally by excluding sea stars from one plot. Call it your test plot, while allowing sea stars access to an otherwise equivalent control plot. You go out twice a day and remove sea stars from the test plot, but you don't remove them from your control plot. Based on our discussion, what is your prediction about the differences that should arise between the test plot and the control? Stop the playback here and answer. Robert Payne did exactly this experiment in the 1960s in Maca Bay in Washington state. He found that in the absence of sea stars, one species, the mussel, came to dominate the bottom while the rest of the encrusting species were driven to local extinction. What this tells us is that competitive exclusion really does happen, or it would happen if not for the predatory starfish continually opening up space for the anemones and barnacles and other things to persist. The starfish plays the role of the keystone species in this community. The metaphor here comes from the details of how you can make a doorway in a stone wall. A regular rectangular door would be unstable because the stones above the doorway, they would just tend to fall into the empty space, probably bringing down the whole wall along with it. But if you make an arch, having the stones curve gradually to meet in the center, you can put a wedge-shaped stone, the keystone, to keep the arch from collapsing under the weight of the rest of the wall. This idea of the keystone applies to our ecological community in the sense that one or two of the species in the community might be extremely important for its stability. Think of each stone in the wall as a different species living in an ecological community. If you were to remove a random stone from the wall, the chances are reasonably good that the wall would continue to stand, albeit with one less stone. Similarly, if you were to pull out one of the species, say the sea anemone from our little hard-bottom community, the effect would be one less species. But if you remove the starfish, you end up with the mussels driving everyone else to local extinction. The community diversity collapses, just like the wall does when you pull out the arch's keystone. In the previous lecture, we developed a mathematically supported conclusion that competition does not allow for multi-species coexistence. But in a real community, there may be other things going on, such as the presence of a keystone predator, that make it entirely possible for competing species to coexist, maybe even for a long enough period of time to allow them to co-evolve. Does this invalidate the idea of competitive exclusion or suggest that its implications regarding coevolution are unimportant? I would argue no. If anything, the results of Payne's experiment demonstrates that the strongest species of competitor really does win when the keystone predator is removed. This is an experimental validation of the competitive exclusion principle. The mitigating factor, here the keystone predator, is required in order to not have the outcome of one species winning out over all the others. Presumably, with other kinds of interactions like parasite-host or mutualist-mutualist, there is no requirement of a special condition in order to have coexistence, no hurdle to jump over, and so we can still expect that coevolution will happen more frequently, maybe more profoundly, for community interactions other than competition. Here's another classic example from the intertidal. Two species of acorn barnacle. These are barnacles that look like little volcanoes or cones whose bases are cemented to the underlying rock. The animal inside, a crustacean, feeds by extending long rake-like cirripeds when the barnacle is submerged, like during high tides. But at low tide, when you're likely to see them, they close up shop and seal themselves in to avoid drying out while they're exposed to the air and the sun. If you go out to the rocky intertidal practically anywhere in the world, you'll find two genera of acorn barnacle. Thamellus, which has a dubious distinction of being one of the very few words starting with a silent ch, and Belinus, which has even less distinction. The two species, they're similar. Belinus is a bit larger in size and whiter in color. Thamellus is smaller and grayer. These two share the rocky intertidal, defined as a zone of the rocky shoreline that alternates between being submerged below sea level at high tides and above sea level during low tides. They share the rocky intertidal, but they also have a predictable pattern of distribution within the intertidal. Thamellus are almost always on higher ground in the upper intertidal, while Belinus are in the lower parts of the intertidal. Joseph Connell, working in Scotland in the 1950s, ran an experiment in which he manipulated plots of the intertidal by excluding either Belinus or Thamellus. Basically, this means that in one plot, he, or actually his students, repeatedly chipped off any Belinus barnacles they saw growing, while in the other plot they similarly chipped off the Thamellus barnacles. In the Belinus exclusion plots, he found that Thamellus barnacles did well in their normal area near the top of the intertidal, and they also colonized further down into what is normally Belinus' zone of occupation. And in the Thamellus exclusion plots, the Belinus barnacles did well in their normal area, but they did not extend any higher. In other words, they did not invade into the part of the intertidal normally occupied by Thamellus. Take some time to process this result, specifically how it both validates the principle of competitive exclusion, while it also offers another mitigating factor that allows for the continued coexistence of Thamellus and Belinus. Let's start with some basic terminology that always tags along with this narrative. An organism's fundamental niche is the entire range of habitat that it could occupy, whereas its realized niche is that portion of the fundamental niche that it actually does occupy in nature. Here, Thamellus' fundamental niche spans more or less the full swath of the intertidal. This fact is established by Connell's results after having excluded the Belinus. However, its realized niche is only the upper stretches of that swath. Belinus has a fundamental niche that is narrower than that of Thamellus, just the lower portion, and it's also the same as its realized niche. Think about this result. Thamellus does not get to use the lower part of the intertidal as its realized niche because Yeah, Thamellus is prevented from occupying the lower part of its fundamental niche because it's outcompeted by Belinus barnacles. You can actually see competitive exclusion happening as Belinus takes over the lower intertidal from Thamellus. So, what is it that allows these two competitors to continue to coexist, presumably facing selective pressure imposed by the other species? Why don't we see the stronger competitor, in this case Belinus, winning and driving Thamellus to local extinction? Well, it's because Thamellus has the upper part of the intertidal that's not included in Belinus's fundamental niche. There, Thamellus has refuge from being outcompeted. Belinus barnacles face attempted takeovers every year as millions of Thamellus babies, the larvae actually, settle out and attempt to establish in their part of the intertidal. Even though Belinus is the superior competitor, it continually gets to hone its competitive chops by this exposure to the other species. Now you might be wondering what exactly the Belinus are doing to be competitively superior to the Thamellus. Good question. Aren't they just stupid little sessile barnacles? Well, yes, they are, in fact, stupid little sessile barnacles. They really have only two jobs: grow larger and stay connected to the rocky substrate. It turns out that Belinus does a better job of both, but most critically, it holds onto the substrate with greater strength. So as it grows outward, it can butt up against another Belinus, and neither barnacle wins. They just jam up against each other on the rock surface. But when a growing Belinus meets up with a Thamellus barnacle, it undercuts its foe, causing the poor Thamellus to be dislodged and washed away. You might look at this ability, the competitive strength of Belinus, as having evolved, at least in part, in response to competition from Thamellus. In this example, you again have a mitigating factor: Thamellus' refuge from competition in the upper intertidal, to explain why you have persistent coexistence, which, at least in theory, has allowed some degree of evolution in response to ecological competition. Something like this could also play out with our sheep and goats. Maybe sheep outcompete goats in the flatter areas, but goats can thrive on plants growing in the near vertical crags of the islands, places where the sheep can't reach. Both of these examples, keystone predators and refuge for the weaker competing species, could mitigate what is otherwise a valid outcome of competitive exclusion, thereby allowing long-term coexistence of competing species. I chose these examples because they're relatively easy to follow. Don't want to pull anything weird on the last lecture of the semester, and they illustrate the kinds of things that might be there in real life that could alter the course of ecology and evolution for organisms in a community. I'd like to present an example of two species locked in a coevolutionary relationship that goes deeper than what we've seen so far. The evolutionary interaction between a host plant and its herbivores is a really important one because nearly all of any plant's secondary chemistry, that's the biochemistry beyond the bare or primary necessities of photosynthesis, growth, and reproduction, are the result of natural selection imposed by its herbivores. For a plant, chemistry is really your only choice for defending yourself against the things that are out there wanting to eat you. Okay, there are spines as well. But apart from spiny things, you can tell a well-defended plant by its lack of herbivory. Not so many holes in a plant's leaves is usually a pretty good sign that it's not a good idea for you to taste it. But there's a catch. If there's lots of herbivore damage on a plant and no dead herbivores nearby, that's no guarantee that it's safe to eat, because for every toxic plant, there's probably some specialist herbivore that's able to tolerate that plant's toxins. and you might be looking at a horrifically poisonous plant with lots of damage from one of these specialists. How do specialist herbivores evolve? And how do specialist herbivores affect the evolution of their host plants? Well, it's a pretty straightforward story, actually. You might envision the ancestral state in which a plant is not toxic and the herbivore is not tolerant of any toxins. Now, plants that start producing some amount of toxins, they're better protected against herbivory compared with less toxic plants. Meanwhile, herbivores that are better able to tolerate toxins do better than less tolerant herbivores. Some herbivores develop higher tolerances to a wide range of plant toxins. These are the generalists, and most mammalian herbivores would fall into this category. Mammals are long-lived to the point where they really couldn't focus on a single species of host plant. Koalas are sort of an exception to this, but most other mammalian herbivores are generalists. Insects, on the other hand, may also be generalists. A grasshopper is a good example. But some species specialize, becoming tolerant of the toxins produced by those plants that have become toxic enough for generalists to have to avoid. If there is continued selective pressure from both generalist and specialist herbivores, the plants respond by increasing their level of toxicity. And what you have is basically chemical warfare, leading to an evolutionary arms race, with plants continually ratcheting up their toxicity and herbivores, in particular the specialists, becoming increasingly able to deal with the toxins produced by the plant. A classic example of this is with the genus of host plant Asclepias, a milkweed, and the specialist herbivore Danaus plexipus, the monarch butterfly. Asclepias milkweeds, they can be horrifically toxic. They have alkaloids and cardiac glycosides that would kill a cow that happened to munch a plant down. Not a likely occurrence because these plants are also extremely unpalatable. The cow would spit it out and immediately learn never to eat that kind of plant again. Monarchs, however, do just fine with the milkweed toxins. Herbivore host plant coevolution? Demonstrated. But there's more to the story. The monarch butterflies, or actually their larvae, monarch butterfly caterpillars, have become able to sequester or store the toxins in their bodies rather than detoxifying them. Some of these host plant toxins are also passed on to the bodies of the adults after metamorphosis, and so both monarch caterpillars and the adults are protected against their predators by the same anti-herbivore chemicals produced by the host plant. Score 1 for the herbivore species. And it's easy enough to see how this would evolve. Ancestrally, the caterpillars were not toxic. Mutational variation caused them to retain plant chemicals, and this was advantageous because it made them mildly toxic to their predators. Greater and greater toxicity was favored, and eventually gave rise to the levels of toxin sequestration seen in modern monarchs. The third part of the story is where things get a bit perplexing. The other thing about monarchs, both larvae and adults, is that they're brightly colored and do nothing to hide their presence from potential bird predators. Most kinds of caterpillar are pretty hard to spot in their host plant. They blend in with camouflage, or as we say, crypsis. Their cryptic coloration and behavior makes them less apparent to their predators, and generally this is a good thing. Monarchs, however, are just the opposite. We call this style of existence the opposite of crypsis, aposomaticism. Aposematically colored organisms are boldly advertising their presence to predators, basically warning them to stay away. Hey, I'm really bad news, so you'd best leave me alone, is the message that they're communicating to potential predators. Predators tend to be a lot smarter than herbivores. So if a cow can learn to avoid a milkweed after tasting it just once, a predator will easily learn to avoid a toxic bug, especially if it's nice enough to advertise its toxicity with bright coloration. We know how well this works. Most of us are very well conditioned to avoid touching small things with yellow and black stripes because we know that, yeah, it could be a honeybee or a yellow jacket or some other yellow and black wasp that has a nasty stinger, and you'd have to be a little bit crazy to pick one up in your hand and even crazier to put it in your mouth. Just in the same way that you've learned to avoid yellow and black stripes, birds have learned to avoid the bright coloration pattern of both monarch larvae and monarch adults. So what's so perplexing about this? Isn't it a good thing for toxic bugs to advertise their toxicity to predators? If monarchs did not have aposematic coloration, in other words, if they were just plain drab, they would presumably be eaten or at least tasted by birds that would mistake them for something that isn't toxic. All of the non-toxic bugs, they would have cryptic coloration, right? So if this toxic bug is also cryptic, how am I supposed to know to avoid it? The problem is basically this. In order to have any reason to evolve aposematicism, you have to be toxic to begin with. You don't want to advertise your presence with bright coloration to predators if you're yummy. And you don't get to be toxic from square one. You have to evolve your toxicity from a starting point of being yummy and presumably also cryptically colored. So starting out yummy and cryptic, the next stage is becoming toxic and cryptic. That part is okay. It's the next step that's problematic. If your species is toxic and cryptic, a mutational change that makes you brightly colored is not going to have an advantage initially. Why? Well, in order for aposematicism to be advantageous over crypsis, the predators must know to avoid the bright coloration. That's a learned avoidance. In order to educate the predators to avoid the bright pattern, quite a few brightly colored individuals must get tasted and spit out before that avoidance on the part of the predators will ensue. If you are the pioneer brightly colored toxic bug, you will die. There's no advantage to aposematicism when rare, and so there's no obvious path to its evolution unless you're somehow able to overcome the obstacle of frequency dependence. And what I mean by that is that aposematicism must be adequately abundant at a high enough frequency in order for it to result in higher fitness relative to the state of crypsis. If somehow you ended up with, say, 50% of the bugs in your generation as aposematic, then you could expect natural selection to favor its evolution. Short of that, your species will probably end up staying cryptic, even though you're toxic. Mutations start out rare, and so that reaching of the critical abundance, the critical mass, is not something that's really going to happen. This scenario is actually a little bit like something we saw earlier this semester. Remember the deal with tit for tat and unconditional defection? It's the same thing. Tit for tat is only advantageous over unconditional affection if there are enough tit for tat players to give them the benefits of mutual cooperation. Otherwise, it would be driven to extinction by predominance of unconditional defectors. That may be too long ago for you to remember. But one idea that we floated was that if you had a sort of founder effect operating, if, for example, you could see one local population being established by a tit-for-tat founder and reaching the critical threshold for natural selection to favor it, then it could become established and spread to other groups. Not an easy thing to do, but within the realm of possibility. In the case of aposematicism, though, there may be a much easier pathway. Let's say your species, had reached the point of being toxic and cryptic, not yearning to be aposematic because that would imply teleology, but you understand that a state of having warning coloration would give you a strong fitness advantage over your present state of being cryptic. If you had a mutation causing bright coloration that was purple with pink polka dots, that would be pretty weird. Easy to notice, memorable, but not avoided by predators, you would die. That's basically the problem of frequency dependence right there. But if your coloration pattern was yellow with black stripes, you could enjoy an immediate advantage. Why? Most predators will, like us, have learned to avoid yellow and black after having associated with a very negative experience after holding a yellow jacket in their mouth. Basically, by using a pattern of warning coloration that's established in your area that predators have already learned to avoid, you don't have the obstacle of frequency dependence that you would need to overcome if you had tried to go with a brand new pattern. We know of examples where many unrelated species of toxic or otherwise noxious forms share the same warning coloration pattern. Yellow jackets and honeybees, both nasty to be stung by, both similar in their bright appearance. In tropical forests, you can find whole assemblages of butterflies that look superficially alike, all sharing the same bright pattern, but on closer inspection, you find that they are of many different species. Moreover, the prevailing pattern may change from one locale to the next. A butterfly assemblage on Barrow, Colorado Island might have red wings with black tips, while an assemblage in northwestern Costa Rica, including species closely related to the ones on BCI, they have white and black stripes. Now, when a toxic species evolves to mimic an established toxic model, this is known as Mullerian mimicry. As we just discussed, this is understandable because the mimic is able to sidestep what is otherwise a difficult obstacle of frequency dependence in its evolution of aposematic or warning coloration. But sometimes the mimic is perfectly yummy, not having any noxious toxins at all. It's just gaining an advantage by mimicking a coloration pattern that predators in its area have learned to avoid. When the mimic is non-toxic, this is a different situation. We call it Batesian mimicry, and there are plenty of examples of this as well. You're probably familiar with a few yourself. Bee flies have yellow and black stripes, just like bees, but they're about as dangerous as a housefly. Longhorn beetles also often have yellow and black stripes, and they are also not dangerous. Stingless bees, including the males of honeybees, are often the same color as regular stingy bees. Now, my final question to you, and you'll answer this for me on the test, is as follows. Earlier in this lecture, we classified the interactions between two species as plus plus for mutualistic, plus minus for parasitic or predatory, or minus minus for competitive. Which of these fits the interaction between a toxic Mullerian mimic and its toxic model species? And which of these fits the interaction between a non-toxic Batesian mimic and its toxic model species? And you should be able to explain your reasoning. That's it. See you on test day.